Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're really digging into Adam Grant's book, Originals. Originals, how non-conformists move the world. It's got me thinking differently about, well, thinking differently.
It's a good one. Grant really digs into what makes those folks who shake things up tick. Like what sets them apart. It's not always what you'd expect.
Right, like that whole first mover advantage thing. Turns out, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
Grant talks about settlers, those who kind of hang back, refine things. What's the deal with that?
He's saying it's not just about being first, but about being strategic.
Yeah.
Like Warby Parker, right? They waited for the whole e-commerce thing to take off instead of jumping in right away.
Oh, smart.
It shows a different side of originality. It's not always this big impulsive leap. Sometimes it's about patience, careful timing.
That makes sense. So it's more calculated than we often think.
Totally.
Yeah.
He even uses the term, what was it? Calculated risk-taking. It's about being thoughtful, weighing the odds.
Calculated risk-taking. So it's not just blindly jumping off the cliff. There's more to it.
Nope, there's a method to the madness. Grant breaks it down really well. Speaking of breaking things down, let's talk about speaking up. When you have that idea that goes against the grain.
Yeah, how do you actually get people to listen?
Well, Grant talks about this thing called deep acting.
Deep acting. Like method acting for ideas.
Kind of. It's about really understanding and managing your emotions. But it's more than that. It's like you're trying to predict how other people will react to what you're saying. You're putting yourself in their shoes.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about, like, unleashing your passion raw and unfiltered.
Not exactly. I mean, passion's important, but this is more about channeling it effectively. Thinking about your delivery, your audience.
So strategically managing your emotions, basically.
Yeah. And he backs it up with research, which is cool. Like, remember that whole thing about venting your anger? Like punching a pillow or whatever?
Yeah, like, get it all out.
Right. Well, Grant actually cites these studies that show that venting, even physically, can make you more aggressive afterwards.
Whoa, really? I always thought that was supposed to help.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it. You're just getting all riled up.
Wow, that's wild.
It is. It really challenges those conventional ideas about emotional expression. And it highlights the importance of finding more constructive outlets for those feelings, instead of just exploding.
It's about finding a way to make your voice heard without, like, yelling.
Exactly. And deep acting gives you a framework for doing just that.
So deep acting, it's like a whole new way to think about expressing yourself. But it makes me wonder, can you actually, like, teach someone to be original, to be that person who speaks up, challenges the norm?
That's a great question. And yeah, Grant actually digs into that. It's not so much about teaching, but more like nurturing, I guess.
Nurturing.
Yeah, he talks about how our upbringing plays a role, even the stories we read as kids. It's about encouraging that independent thinking.
Oh, interesting. So, like, ditching Goodnight Moon for something a little more rebellious.
Huh. Not necessarily. But there's actually research on this. It's pretty fascinating. Like, they looked at children's books in the U.S., ones that emphasize kids achieving original things.
Okay.
And guess what? They found a link between those themes and a surge in patents a few decades later. It's like those stories planted a seed or something.
Wow. So early exposure really does have an impact. But what about when those kids grow up and, get jobs? How do you build that kind of originality into a whole company culture?
Well, Grant talks about this idea of cultural contribution.
Cultural contribution.
Yeah, he says a lot of companies focus on cultural fit, which, sounds good on the surface, right?
Yeah, sure.
But he argues that it can actually stifle creativity. You end up with everyone thinking the same way.
Makes sense.
Instead, he says, we should look for people who bring different perspectives, challenge the status quo. That's what he calls cultural contribution.
So less about fitting in, more about shaking things up.
Exactly. And it's not just about who you hire, but how you encourage dissent, how you make it okay to disagree. He even gives this example of this. Get this, billionaire investor guy who actually fires people for not criticizing him.
Whoa, seriously? Talk about tough love.
Right. It sounds kind of crazy, but his point is that he wants people to challenge him, to push back. He sees it as essential for making good decisions.
Interesting. So it's about creating that space where people feel safe disagreeing, like we were talking about with deep acting.
Exactly. It all ties together. Leaders have to be open to hearing different viewpoints, and individuals need to know how to express those viewpoints effectively.
Yeah, like a two-way street. So how do you actually create that environment? Does Grant get into specifics?
He does. Like, he talks about shifting from exit interviews to entry interview.
Entry interviews, what's that?
So instead of waiting until someone's leaving to ask for their feedback, you pick their brain right when they start.
Oh, I get it. Fresh eyes, new perspective.
Exactly. Makes them feel valued from day one, too.
Mhm.
Grant also talks about peer feedback. He says we should be regularly asking our colleagues for their thoughts. They can often be more objective than our bosses.
That's a good point. Sometimes it's easier to be honest with your peers.
Totally. And speaking of honesty, remember that thing about the Sarek effect?
Sarek effect? Ringing a bell, but remind me.
Okay, so full disclosure,
Huh.
Grant totally made that term up. It's not a real thing.
Okay.
But he uses it to illustrate this very real psychological thing called the mere exposure effect. Basically, the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to like it, even if it's something as random as the word Sarek.
Huh. I kind of like it now that you mention it.
Right. It's funny how our brains work. But it's a good reminder that even unconventional ideas, the more we encounter them, the more familiar, the more acceptable they become.
So it's about repetition, persistence, getting your message out there consistently.
Absolutely. It's especially important for those groundbreaking ideas, the ones that might initially be met with resistance.
Because sometimes the weirdest ideas are the ones that change the world.
Exactly. But you got to give people time to come around. And that brings us to another crucial element. Timing.
Timing, yeah. Feels like sometimes you can have a brilliant idea, but if the timing's off, it just goes nowhere.
Right, it's crucial. And Grant actually pushes back on that whole gotta be first thing.
Oh, really?
He actually advocates for strategic procrastination.
Strategic procrastination. Okay, now that's something I can get behind. But seriously, is there such a thing?
He makes a good case. He's saying that sometimes putting things off a bit can actually make you more creative. You
Right.
get some distance, let your mind wander.
Interesting. So like stepping away from the problem for a bit.
Exactly. He
Yes.
talks about this study where students who procrastinated on a business plan ended up with more original ideas than those who didn't. Makes you wonder if we should all schedule in some procrastination time.
Right. I'm putting that on my calendar right now. But seriously, how do you know when to actually stop procrastinating and, actually get to work?
Good point. It's a balance, for sure. Grant talks about the importance of recognizing the right moment, like when the market's ready for your idea or when your audience is primed to really hear what you have to say.
So reading the room, essentially.
Yeah.
Knowing when to make your move.
Exactly. He gives the example of Jackie Robinson. Talk about a guy who knew how to make a statement. But even he was strategic about his timing, like when he stole home plate in the World Series. Talk about a power move, but it was the right moment. It made an impact.
Wow. Yeah, perfect example. It's like you can be bold, but choosing when and how to be bold is everything.
Exactly. And Grant says this applies not just to individual moments, but to, like, a whole career. We tend to think of originality as this young person's game, right?
Yeah, it's like, gotta have all the best ideas by the time you're 30, or else.
Right. But Grant shows that's not necessarily true. He talks about all these amazing artists and thinkers who had their biggest breakthroughs later in life. He talks about the difference between conceptual innovators versus experimental innovators. The conceptual people, they have that big idea early on and they run with it. But the experimental folks, they kind of evolve over time. They're constantly trying new things, learning from their mistakes.
So different paths to originality makes you realize it's not a race, it's more like a journey.
Exactly. It's a lifelong process of exploring, discovering, and that's what makes it so exciting. So to bring it all back, why does this all matter? Why should we care about being more original?
Yeah, what's the takeaway for all of us non-geniuses out there?
It's about creating a world where more people feel empowered to challenge the status quo, to question things, to bring their own unique perspective. And Grant's not saying we all have to be like revolutionaries or anything. It's more about tapping into that creative spark we all have inside, using it to make things better, even in small ways.
I love that. It's not about being the next big inventor or anything. It's about bringing a little more of ourselves, a little more of our own thinking into the world. It's inspiring, really. It makes you want to go out and, I don't know, shake things up a bit.
That's what it's all about.
Well, on that note, I think we've done our fair share of shaking things up today. This has been a fascinating deep dive into Adam Grant's originals. It's definitely given us a lot to think about, wouldn't you say?
For sure.
So to our listeners, keep those original ideas flowing, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.